The American Southwest is unlike any other place on Earth. A massive, expansive, mostly unexplored open landscape of jagged cliffs, rugged mountains, high open plains, enormous basins, wide canyons, and colossal mesas standing like towers, all strewn across a great desert panorama. A terrain of natural wonders create this beyond picturesque scenery that is literally a portrait of the power of nature. A person couldn't visit this ancient vista without noticing the sheer magnificence of this environment and wondering, did this place always look like this? The American Southwest is like a history book whose pages are written in layers of strata, whose stories are told through our observations of nature, and whose past history seems to be frozen in time. How did this land come to be such an astonishment before the world? A person couldn't help but to imagine that at one time this landscape was totally different than we perceive it today. And that imagination needs no scientific explanation from a so-called expert in geology. An enlightened person can feel it in their bones, in their soul. This place didn't always appear as it does today. Never has a place felt so ancient and new at the same damn time. The history surrounding this place is even much older than the so-called indigenous people who now inhabit these territories on government-allocated reservations. This land, which now sits mostly uninhabited and desolate, was once possibly the most historically significant place of the ancient world. Of all the geological characteristics that this territory is known for, the Grand Canyon is by far the most popular, although there are several other canyons of comparable uniqueness that fly under the radar. The history of the territory surrounding these canyon lands as we know it is very short and incomplete, and of course written through the words of charlatans and conquistadors. One of the first, if not the first, Spaniard on record to lead an expedition into the territory was Francisco Vasquez de Coronado in the year 1540. As legend states, he had come to the area in search for the fabled city of El Dorado, one of the 7 cities of gold, obsessed over by conquistadors and all heathens alike. Apparently, a primary focus of many of these first conquistadors, Italians, Spaniards, and Portuguese, was to locate these mythical cities, and they continued doing so for hundreds of years. The legendary accounts of the cities of gold began as a simple rumor shared by Indians to the invaders, and once hearing these rumors, the invaders spread like wildfire onto the continent, to the point that any heathen with a boat was ready to risk it all to die a legend like Drake.
It was somebody that I was like, I used to see out and be like, yo, that's that nigga, you know what I'm saying? He's doing his thing.
No. Not that Drake. That Drake. Yeah. That Drake. There we go, if I enjoy. I'm a legend, suffrage's Drake. All you other pirates are fake. All you pirates are fake, yeah. I've been on the ship for a minute now. I've been overseas for a minute now.
Yo, that's that nigga, you know what I'm saying? He's doing his thing.
Sorry. Continuing. But unfortunately, all of these heathens died in a fruitless search that expanded from the jungles of South America to the rocky canyons of the American Southwest. Most archaeologists and historians commonly agree that if there was such a place, it was in the secluded highlands of the Muisca in present-day Colombia. They say this mainly due to the abundance of gold witnessed and documented by several colonial sources, who reported that gold was so abundant among these people that it was routinely and ritually discarded during ceremonies and thrown into the bottom of a deep lake, never to be recovered. Because you know they tried to go get that shit. From this experience, they were informed of other cities, which only led to more adventurous heathens to try their hand in the great New World search for gold. But was this really even the New World? New to them, maybe, but not new to the people who had been inhabiting the land since time immemorial. And just like the city of gold was unknown to the conquistador at the time, so was any knowledge concerning that of ancient Egypt. So even by the time the first Spanish missions arrived in the Southwest and Mexico, not even their most educated religious Jesuit clergy had known anything about the histories, cultures, and languages of ancient Egypt. Because if they had known, why didn't they make any of the obvious connections that we will soon uncover? When referring to the Southwest, we mean specifically areas colonized and controlled by the Spanish in Durango, Mexico, Chihuahua, Sonora, all the way to the west in Baja California, all the way north to areas of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. As was the case with nearly all endeavors into the New Old World, another primary objective in dealing with the Indians was conversion into Catholicism. The first Spanish mission in current-day New Mexico was established in 1598, and 24 more were built within the next 100 years. Santa Fe was impounded in 1607, making it just as old as Jamestown, Virginia, second only to St. Augustine, Florida, another city confiscated by the Spanish, in contrast to the eastern United States, where the Spanish had little to no territory. The vast territories of the American Southwest and Mexico were slowly becoming annexed into Spanish control. This quote is coming from Charlatan's Web, and I just need you to understand that. The name Cibola first entered recorded history in 1539 when the Spaniards in southern New Spain, present-day Mexico and Central America, heard rumors that there was a province by this name with the 7 cities of gold, located across the desert hundreds of leagues north. These rumors were largely caused by reports given by the 4 shipwrecked survivors of the failed Navarre expedition, including Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and an African slave, Estevancio. Upon finally returning to New Spain, the adventurers said that they had heard stories from the natives about cities of great and limitless riches. Upon hearing the castaways' tales, Mendoza organized an expedition headed by Deniza, who took Estevancio as his guide. Estevancio was this African. They make sure to let you know that Estevancio is an African. But he was Marcos Deniza's guide into New Mexico. Think about that. During the voyage in a place called Vacapa, probably located around the state of Sonora, Deniza sent Estevancio to scout ahead. A short while later, Estevancio met a monk who had heard stories from the native of the cities called Cibola, said to be overflowing with riches. Estevancio did not wait for the friar, but instead continued traveling until he reached Cibola, where, at the hands of the Zuni tribe, he met his death, and his companions were forced to flee. Deniza returned to Mexico City and said that the expedition had continued even after the death of Estevancio. He claimed that they had seen Cibola from a great distance and that it was larger than Tenochtitlan. In this city, the people used dishes of gold and silver, decorated their houses with turquoise, and had gigantic pearls, emeralds, and other beautiful gems. It is now believed by some historians that the mica-inflected clay of the adobe pueblos may have created an optical illusion when inflamed by the setting sun, thus fueling the tale. Oh, it was the clay. There was mica in the clay and it all looked like gold. I got you. That's a hell of a response. Upon hearing the news, Mendoza wasted no time in organizing a large military expedition to take possession of the riches that the monk had described with such vivid detail. Upon the viceroy's command, Coronado began his expedition, taking the friar Deniza as his guide. Coronado left with a small group of explorers from Culiacan in 1540. When Coronado arrived at Huica Pueblo, which chroniclers called Cibola, he discovered that Marcos Deniza's stories were lies, and that there were in fact no treasures as the friar had described. He had also found that contrary to the friar's account, the sea was not within view from that region, but it was instead many days' journey away. Nevertheless, Coronado occupied the region by military force and used it as a base for future expeditions. Gotcha. So I wonder what exactly happened. Not only did this city not exist, but there was no sea close by. So I know we see a lot of these places as totally different because we have modern borders stuck in our brain. But I need you to understand something from a geographic standpoint. Texas is really Mexico. If you go to the most southern tip of Texas, you're literally in central Mexico if you were to travel due west from the southern point. So keep that in mind when we're discussing a lot of these areas that seem to be disassociated due to our modern mind function of how modern borders work. So one of the earliest missionaries to the Southwest was Marcos Deniza, a French missionary and Franciscan friar from the city of Nice in the Duchy of Savoy. Marcos led the first expedition to explore what is now the American Southwest. His report of finding a beautiful city more extensive than that of Mexico City induced Viceroy Mendoza to organize a large-scale entrada under the leadership of Coronado. Marcos served as a guide for this expedition, but when they failed to find the wealth they expected, Coronado blamed Marcos and called him a liar and sent him back to Mexico in disgrace. You liar, you lied about the city of gold, you liar. Marcos remains a controversial historical figure, and historians have argued without resolution over the veracity of his report and the itinerary of his expedition. So the mythical city of gold or the great city that was even greater than Tenochtitlan, referenced by Marcos Deniza, was supposedly the Zuni Cibola complex, is a collection of prehistoric and archaeological sites on the Zuni Pueblo reservations in western New Mexico. According to Marcos Deniza, not only was this a great city of gold, bigger than Tenochtitlan, it was also connected to great waterways and the sea. So the question would be, Was Deniza actually telling the truth about this great city in New Mexico? Or was it a complete falsification? Because apparently he saw it with his own eyes. He believed in the city so much that he persuaded the Coronado expedition, which of course meant it probably made it all the way back to Spain, that some Franciscan friar happens to be French, by the way. You see what I mean when I say they're all family? It's a French missionary, but he is leading the Coronado expedition into the mythical city of gold in New Mexico. So the question would be, would a friar put his entire life and reputation on the line to tell another expedition about a mythical city of gold that didn't exist? Not only did the city of gold not exist, but the waterways around the city and the location that he attributed to also don't exist. So was he completely lying to his own people? It would be one thing to lie to somebody else, but to lie to his own people and to risk lives in sending an expedition all the way to New Mexico for the purposes of some gigantic ruse? He's supposed to be one of the most credible people, if not the most credible person on the expedition. He's the religious man. Yet he would risk lives of other people to go find a city that doesn't exist? Thus far, from a colonial standard, the French have been the star players in this Egyptian conspiracy. But let's not forget the Spanish are them niggas' cousins. So they also play a very key role in this historical hijack as well. And much of that history was lost in translation due to the pen of Jesuit scribes. From this point in the early stages of Spanish, Portuguese, Italian colonialism, the histories concerning the indigenous Americans began to take form through the lens and pens of the European. Oral histories were recorded and translated to priests who then compiled research learned from these people in the form of codex and manuscripts. Although not the first, but perhaps the most complete methodology for indigenous record keeping was introduced by Bernardino Sahagún. Many historians consider him the father of ethnology and anthropology for his highly acclaimed work, The General History of the Things of New Spain, including its most notable manuscript, the Florentine Codex. A 2,400-page manuscript written in Spanish and Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the time, and consisting of more than 2,000 illustrations covering subjects from history to trade to economics to cosmology to rituals. Spending over 60 years in Mexico, Bernardino Sahagún is credited for his detailed and overwhelmingly abundant intelligence on Aztec culture, being fluent in Nahuatl for over 50 years. It is likely that he translated books out of the Christian Bible into the Nahuatl language. Many of these Christian stories taught to the Indians have been amalgamated into their indigenous rituals. His travels followed the invasion of Tenochtitlan by Hernán Cortés by 8 years, and by 1536 he had helped found the Colegio de Santa Cruz, a school originally built to educate indigenous men of the nobility class into Latinized Catholics. As acclaimed by many historians and anthropologists, Sahagún is presumably the most credible Spanish source on the subject of pre-Columbian history pertaining to the Nahuatl and pre-Aztec or Mexica civilizations, as the information recorded by later Franciscan priests like Diego de Landa Calderón is far less credible and hasn't stood the test of time. While most inaccuracies attributed to Sahagún's work were later altered by various pens of other scribes after his death. Even his original Florentine Codex has gone missing from the scrutiny of the public eye. Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo sin saber si voy.
Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo si no estoy.
It would be nearly 100 years before the Franciscan Order would cross over into present-day New Mexico and establish their missions in the Santa Fe territory. Their sole objective in dealing with the Indians, as was the case for the British and French, was conversion. Simply put, they were merchants of other gods. Several accounts state that the Indians were extremely idolatrous. However, some scholars have pushed back, asserting that idolatry was used as an excuse for mistreatment and enslavement of natives. Essentially, they had become unconsciously engaged in a religious war. These religious wars fought on the heels of a massive catastrophe, most likely a series of semi-cataclysmic events that changed the geology of the earth. This area of the continent changed face from a well-watered metropolis full of wonders to the arid, desolate, otherworldly ghost realm we recognize as Planet Four Corners today. The majority of these groups, recognized as quasi-indigenous from the Southwest, were actually supplanter populations who migrated from other areas after the catastrophe. Whatever happened out there is the hidden saga of Earth history, often recasted through indigenous mythology. An area once sprawling with people and advanced civilization is now literally uninhabited. Millions of undiscovered acreage man has not stepped foot upon since ancient times. During ancient times, this place was quite different, especially regarding the people archaeologists say were inhabiting the area prior to colonization. As we will come to learn, many of the civilizations in operation spanning back at least a millennia had just fallen prior to the arrival of the first Spaniards to the Southwest. The dominant cultures in the region as classified by accepted archaeology were the Patayan, the Mongolian, the Hohokam, and the Anasazi or ancestral Puebloans, all of whom the archaeologists say disappeared in the years between 1350 and 1500. Similar to the exact same damn time they say all of the civilizations along the Mississippi disappeared. Would these parallels just so happen to be a coincidence? Or are the fall of these seemingly unconnected civilizations tied together somehow? And what does any of this have to do with America being Egypt? Hold your horses. You know, the same horses they say never existed in America. Hold those horses. What are these canyons and massive expanses hiding? And who was living in this area before? This region is the home to several different subdivisions of the civilizations mentioned earlier, and their various dialects have since been divided by archaeologists and linguists into two dialectical divisions of the Uto-Aztecan language family, Northern and Southern. The northern divisions include, but not limited to, the Hopi, the Saran, the Ute, the Shoshone, the Comanche, the latter falling under the Numic subdivision. The southern divisions include Pieman, Tarahumaran, Cajita, and Aztecan, from which branches of the Nahuatl language are spoken. Nahuatl is the most widely spoken of the remaining dialects, still officially being utilized in the rural parts of central and western Mexico. As is the case with any language from the past, the modern scholar has no real-time working understanding of ancient tongue from a natural fluency perspective, therefore leaving nuggets of transliterary acumen imprisoned in the shackles of time and misconception. Be all this as it may, there are people who claim to have an all-knowing knowledge of dead languages from the past. To add to this conceit, these so-called expert linguistic scholars also profess an all-knowing knowledge of linguistic relationships between all groups of people throughout the history of time. The prioritized individuals of the academic community have been hired for one reason only: to uphold the status quo, and of course dispelling any legitimate information that does not fall in line with this status quo. And in this case, language has sent the Ivy League status quo pushing agent into their familiar corner of denial when they are presented with facts contradicting their template. The first and foremost theories at the head of their template are first the theory of evolution, and secondly, the Bering Strait migration theory. Both of these fallacious theories stand as academia's gods of historical fiction, and all so-called accepted history must fall within this atheist construct. Under this construct, the Bering Strait model only works as a result of their accepted evolutionary model, without which it completely falls apart. Could the same be said about language? So when a once esteemed linguist makes an incredible discovery in the field that contradicts their accepted models, is he celebrated or is he shunned?
By the way, in Egyptian we only have the consonants. We know a little bit about the vowels from Coptic, even though they're debatable sometimes. We have a few vowels figured out by transliterations in other languages, but a lot of it is still quite unknown. So the Egyptian consonants for a verb meaning to pierce are T, K, and S. Tixo is the verb in Uto-Aztecan, to pierce or poke. KM is the verb to black or black and brown, any dark color. Kamom in Coptic, I think. Koma is the Uto-Aztecan word for being dark, gray, brown, black. Nami is the word for traveling or crossing something. The word in Uto-Aztecan for traveling, walking around. Nami for crossing an area or a river. Nami. Like I say, there are about 1,000 of these. We're going to show you about 100 of them, or 150. And if you want all of them, they're in a book in the back. And by the title of this, if you want the whole story and you're interested in this kind of thing, you've got all the details in 110 pages back there. You've got anyway. We're just getting the tip of the iceberg here. Anyway, for example, shim in Egyptian, the word for go or walk. Sima in Uto-Aztecan. Sabak, whatever the vowels were in Egyptian. Calf of the leg or lower leg. In Uto-Aztecan, Sipika, same three consonants. Calf of the leg, lower leg. Sabti in Coptic, sopt. Oh, by the way, Coptic is a later form of Egyptian that did put the vowels in. It existed about the time of Christ. Sapti in the Uto-Aztecan language, meaning fence or enclosure. Qabab or qabba in Egyptian, meaning cool, calm, quiet. Kopa, quiet and calm in Uto-Aztecan. Man is another one, ween, so forth. Let's go on to a bunch. Oh yes, now we're getting to something interesting. First I discovered the Kwa dialect of Hebrew, and then I started noticing that all the Egyptian similarities had B changing to P instead of to Kwa. For example, you have the Egyptian word for throat, babit, and in Uto-Aztecan, papi, okay? Identical, except for B's changing to P's. Same meaning. The Egyptian bashi is the verb to vomit or spit out. Bashu is a noun, a verbal noun, or the stuff. In Uto-Aztecan, it matches the noun, pisota, But again, everything matches the W with the O. So this is built on the noun form. Banti, or whatever the vowels were in Egyptian, Piti in Uto-Aztecan. Same thing with Shenabet. Shena is the Tibetan part. Bak and Puuchi, that has to be explained. Beat, the word for bee, Pita, bee and wasp in Uto-Aztecan. In fact, we have to show you the rest of that line. Egyptian has article prefixes. For a feminine noun, you would have wa means a, b. Ta means the, so you'd put that on the front for meaning the bee. And na is the plural the in Egyptian, meaning the bees. So you have wa, ta, and na as prefixes to the word. And here we have in Uto-Aztecan, the Tarahumara language has 3 different variants for this word for bumblebee, napari and tapara and wapara. The para part is simply a vowel change. Since the last vowel is ah, it tends to change the vowels in front of it to ah. That happens real often in English and every other language. So pita becomes pata. Intervocalic T becomes R real often. We do that in English and a lot of other languages. So para is that word for bee, and it has those same 3 prefixes for a feminine noun. And in Egyptian, beat is a feminine noun. Boy, you can't get much better match than that.
Brian Stubbs found such a connection and was, of course, immediately ostracized from the linguistic community. And several academic guard dogs were moved to discredit his work. In the beginning, his work wasn't even considered controversial and initially had been well received when presented to the intellectual public. But as his work became more popular and historical implications began to surface, his work was bombarded by negative reviews from other linguists in academia, often using his religion as a reason for discrediting him. Brian Stubbs was a Mormon, and an easy target for people to say that his work was nothing more than another work of false Mormon propaganda. And there is no connection between the ancient languages of North Africa and the ancient languages of the Indians in the American Southwest. Stubbs was one of the most accredited linguists in his field for over 30 years. Now his work faced scrutiny from people unfamiliar with native languages, Egyptian or Shemitic. His credibility fell into question, not because of the quality of his work, who even his contenders said has always been credible, but because he was a member of LDS. And this stands primarily on the fallacy established by academia that there was no contact between continents prior to colonization. Therefore, his research is completely discarded. His painstakingly difficult work in linguistic comparative method between Uto-Aztecan and ancient Afro-Asiatic languages was extremely detailed, with hundreds of examples and parallels using vocabulary and cognates between 2 seemingly unrelated languages. One of the biggest pushbacks by Stubbs' critics was really an improvable diversionary ploy, a moving of the goalpost, if you will. Their contention is that Stubbs doesn't show enough evidence to prove any Shemitic or Egyptian parentage in the Uto-Aztecan language family, which would nearly be impossible to prove without access to a DeLorean. Remember, our current knowledge of the Egyptian language is only 200 years old, and it hadn't been spoken for over 2,000 years before it was discovered by the French. Additionally, opponents accused Stubbs of cherry-picking the language for similarities to fit his hypothesis, but in reality, these so-called scholars were cherry-picking Stubbs' work in order to manufacture doubt. And this fact lies at the very premise of their contentions. As charlatan linguists often do, they use semantics as their weapon of choice. And this fact is evident in the systematic piling on to discredit Stubbs. While caping for academia, they miss his point entirely. The objective of his research was never to prove a linguistic genetic parentage, only to prove there is distinct genetic relationship between two proto-language families that proves intermixing of cognates, phrases, and words with Old World ancient Shemitic languages into the Uto-Aztecan languages, a point these so-called scholars missed in their blind defense of historical heresy. They discredit the fictional points of their fabricated straw man who they've replaced with Stubbs. The burden of proof is no longer on Stubbs. The burden of proof falls on the greater world of academia to disprove his work, which has yet to be done. But let's say there is zero connection between Uto-Aztecan and Afro-Asiatic languages. Is there any distinct connection between these two seemingly unrelated groups and anything else?
This is that book, and the only reason I show that to you is because a lot of people ask, when they learn about this stuff, well, is it real? Is it what do the authorities think of? Well, I am one of the authorities. There's only 5 or 6 of us in the whole world that do research on this language family, and I wrote the book while the other 5 were busy doing something else.
The problem facing most historians when studying ancient cultures is the issue of lumping all groups into a single lump population group based on linguistic relationship or even geographic proximity, therefore downplaying the characteristics that may distinguish one subset of any population from another that share either language or lands. This forthcoming study is not an attempt to assert such generalities as it pertains to the several population groups that inhabit the Four Corners region or Central West Mexico, but rather this study will highlight the presence of certain rites, philosophies, and customs within specific populations that inhabit those regions, and compare these customs with Old World traditions for the purpose of an intellectually sound comparative analysis between the extinct Egyptians and the crumbs left over from the extinct civilizations that once inhabited this area. As mentioned before in multiple episodes, according to several genetic studies, including the Consortium for the Analysis of the Diversity and Evolution of Latin America and their use of the Globetrotter program to determine dates of admixture for so-called indigenous populations of Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia, the study found that the indigenous populations, as we see them today, are a result of recent and or post-colonial admixture and are not representative of an ancient population. This study furthermore concludes that these groups have older markers that indicate admixture with Moorish, Portuguese, Sephardic Jewish, Spanish, and Italian bloodlines rather than East Asian or Siberian. This information essentially contradicts and reverses the timetable of arrival between the Siberians who supposedly first traversed the Bering Strait, and the Europeans, who supposedly first traversed the Atlantic, meaning the so-called ancient indigenous populations of Central and West Mexico, as well as Southwest America, were more closely related to Moors and Spaniards and Sephardic Jews, and the populations today reflect an influx of the Asian phenotype into the currently misnomered native population. The study also found that sub-Saharan African admixture overlapped with that of Iberian ancestry, pointing to either a contemporaneous arrival to the Americas or possibly a contemporaneous departure from America. This leads to a serious question. Were these colonists related to the Indians they were conquering? Because if that were true, then the connection between two seemingly unrelated groups of people would be undeniable. Human sacrifice is quite possibly one of the most taboo subjects history has to offer. Where did this idea of sacrifice of humans come from? Did it start in a single place? If so, where? And how did this practice reach the four corners of the world, considering half of it was undiscovered? Did one day someone just start sacrificing human life without reason? Or were there reasons behind these sacrifices? And if there were reasons, what were they? These rituals in almost every case pertain to the supernatural, be it to request an act from nature or to acknowledge or satiate a god or deity, or just a ceremonial performance based in a prior cultural tradition, which could have a myriad of hypothetical reasons. Some of those reasons may later be seen as even more practical than barbaric or supernatural. The death penalty is presumably one of the most historically ubiquitous, yet under-acknowledged acts of human sacrifice as a ritual of so-called justice. However, when the topic of human sacrifice among ancient American societies comes up, there's always this idealistic overtone of primitive apocalypto savagery. But some would say there are even instances when sacrifice would seem to have been more practical. It has been documented that sacrifice was used to resolve conflicts that would otherwise lead to war. For example, ball games were played instead of actual war, with the losing captain and/or entire team being sacrificed. These death games were played to avoid large-scale killing. Be all this as it may, there's no indication that these games were void of supernatural rituals satiating or acknowledging gods or deities. Imagine playing a ball game for your life. Niggas was probably out there like the last Boy Scout. Shit. Niggas probably calling every god they possibly could. Hold up. Is that Billy Blanks? Man, I know that nigga face. He looked like Seal Brother, except for he didn't get his face chewed up by a seal. All right. The variations of sacrifice span the globe and are entirely unique to different cultures, histories, and geography. People across the world throughout time have always killed in different ways for different reasons. So when parallels arise between people who have never been in contact, these similarities must be investigated, not ignored. We highlight two of the most popular types of human sacrifice and analyze their practice and usage in both America and Egypt. Beginning with the most well-known types of human sacrifice, there are an assortment of situations and methods once employed in the Americas. We explore with special attention the sacrifice of Aztec prisoners of war. Some people may push back thinking the Aztec civilization was located too far south and historically has nothing to do with the territories to the north. But one must not forget that the Aztecs migrated into the Central Valley of Mexico from those areas north in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. They are believed to be a branch or descendants of the Toltec, who lived just further north. In any case, ruins related to their proxy civilizations have been found as far north as Colorado. Many historians try to disassociate the Puebloan cultures from the Aztec as though there's no historical correlation. But language and genetics would say otherwise, through blood that cannot be avoided. However, the general geogenetic histories of the groups show that neither the Aztecs or the ancestral Puebloans had been living in those areas for any more than a millennia and had both migrated from elsewhere. The vestiges of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico predate the Aztec Empire. So it's reasonable to hypothesize that this ritual of sacrificing prisoners of war occurred as far north as Colorado in the millennia before the populations abruptly relocated south. What was the reason for this abrupt relocation? In most cases with ancient peoples, a mass relocation is usually preceded by a significant event by either man or nature, usually meaning catastrophe or war. As a well-documented ceremonial practice in Mesoamerica, prisoners of war were routinely sacrificed to fire gods old and new. But ancient Egypt has seemed to escape any details about their history of sacrificing their enemies. One of the most famous examples of prisoner sacrifice is on the Narmer stele, which depicts the king smiting his enemies on a tablet that nearly looks identical to the images of Aztec. In fact, there are several depictions within the Mendoza Codex that mirror the Narmer tablet to a T. Is it just by chance that these images from opposite sides of the Atlantic happen to be so similar? The experts say there's absolutely no way there had been any contact between the Americas and Egypt prior to colonization. But why are they so sure? In fields of study regarding the past where nothing can be definitively determined, these scholars are ironclad in their positions, like their positions are gods they have to sacrifice truth to. These people may not be sure about anything in their life, but they're sure about the only thing they can't be sure about. Almost like faith in deception. They say these people could never have been related to the Egyptians. The Aztecs weren't even around during dynastic Egypt. They came much later. A semantical charlatan deflectionary tactic used by academics to sidestep truth with chronological ambiguity. Of course, they could easily say there's no connection according to their narrative. They are separated by millennia. But what about their predecessors and their predecessors' predecessors? What about the civilizations these civilizations sprang from? Another form of sacrifice among the Egyptians that seemed to be more associated with them than any other people in the historical narrative was the retainer sacrifice, a sacrifice in which other people were buried with the deceased, but these people were killed as part of a ritualistic tradition. Slaves, servants, and even wives were sacrificed upon the death of a high-ranking public figure. So as was the case with Egyptian pharaohs, retainer sacrifices were buried along with them, as their belief was that their status would be elevated in the afterlife. And as a matter of mere coincidence, retainer sacrifice has also been practiced in America going back thousands of years during and before the times of ancient Egypt. The Aztec nobles also employed retainer sacrifices in which they would bury slaves and even wives while they were still alive. By this time, ancient Egypt had been extinct for over a millennia, and the so-called pre-Columbian Franciscan scholar didn't even know what ancient Egypt was, and surely had no idea of its 5,000-year history. The Aztecs were far more popular for their forms of sacrifice than were the Egyptians. The Aztecs mostly sacrificed prisoners of war and their own people for a myriad of reasons. There were actually calendar days where the Aztecs would sacrifice people for whatever reason. Men, women, children, and prisoners were all sacrificed, even with children having their hearts chopped out. So I'm going to read an article about the social implication for some of these sacrifices, and it brings to the forefront certain aspects of the control of the masses. Quote, "It has long been accepted that cultures such as the Aztecs long practiced human sacrifice to appease the gods. But now new research suggests that human sacrifice may have even had a darker side. Scientists have now found that these ceremonial killings, which publicly were intended to appease gods, may have enabled elites to stay in power." So think about that approach, because we still see that today. A new religious evolutionary theory called the social control hypothesis suggests that social elites may have used human sacrifice to elevate their status by claiming supernatural approval for themselves. And it would have, of course, instilled enormous fear in the population. They have concluded that it may have encouraged the development of complex civilizations in maritime Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. There's anecdotal evidence from other areas of the world that human sacrifice was used to maintain and control populations, says psychologist Joseph Watts, a doctoral student who studies cultural evolution at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Watts and his team studied social stratification in societies engaged in human sacrifice. They found that it was more common in cultures that were strictly divided along class lines. They found that 2/3 of the highly stratified societies practiced the macabre ritual, compared to just 1/4 of egalitarian societies, as reported in April 2016 in Nature. People often claim that religion underpins morality, Watts says. This study, however, highlights another aspect of belief in the divine. It shows how religion can be exploited by social elites for their own benefit. In Mesoamerican culture, human sacrifices were viewed as a repayment for sacrifices the gods had themselves made in creating the world and the sun. But it cannot be denied that there would also have been a useful secondary effect of intimidation on visiting ambassadors and the populace in general, something the elites would have found convenient to exploit. So let's keep this in mind moving forward. Yes, of course, we know that sacrifices were made to deities and gods, but also, and we should know this, sacrifice was used by the elites to control the populace. Also, another theme central to Aztec mythology, you'll find that many of the Aztec gods sacrificed themselves for mankind. The Aztecs were sun worshippers, so were the Egyptians. Christ being an allegory for the sun, sacrifice is a central theme in Aztec culture and Christian culture, as well as Egyptian culture. The idea of sacrificing wives and slaves following the death of a prominent figure must have independently sprang up on opposite sides of the world, free of any prior relationship or contact. That's what the experts say. But these experts also say that within burials of ancient Americans, dogs were sacrificed when someone died because they believed that dogs were the guides to the underworld after death.
¿Y por qué llorando estoy?
Quick read from Charlatan Central. Quote from Aztec Philosophy, Understanding a World in Motion. The Aztec god that is being represented by the half man, half dog, his name is Xolotl. Edward Saylor associates Xolot's portrayal as a dog with the belief that dogs accompany the souls of the dead to Mictlan. Mictlan is the underworld of the Aztec. He finds further evidence of the association between Xolotl, dogs, death, and Mictlan in the fact that Mesoamericans viewed twins as unnatural monstrosities and consequently commonly killed one of the two twins shortly after birth. Interesting. Saylor speculates that Xolotl represents the murdered twin who dwells in the darkness of Mictlan, while Quetzalcoatl, the precious twin, represents the surviving twin who dwells in the light of the sun. Of course, this has distinct parallels to the stories of ancient Egypt, specifically the story of Osiris and Set. In manuscripts, the setting sun devoured by the earth is opposite Xolotl's image. Quetzalcoatl and Xolotl constitute the twin phases of Venus as the morning and evening star, respectively. Quetzalcoatl as the morning star acts as the harbinger of the sun's rising, rebirth, every dawn. Xolotl as the evening star acts as the harbinger of the sun's setting or death, every dusk. In this way, they divide the single life-death process of cyclical transformation in its two phases, one leading from birth to death, the other from death to birth. End quote. Anubis, the Egyptian dog of funerary rites, is literally deified as the god who ushers souls into the afterlife. Anubis is often depicted in Egyptian hieroglyphs performing funerary tasks, such as embalming or mummification, both of which have longer histories in America than Egypt, by the way. The Egyptologist claims Anubis is an Egyptian god with the head of a jackal. But have you seen a jackal? Do any illustrations of Anubis really look like a jackal? In America, dogs were included in retainer sacrifices, from the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys all the way to the American Southwest and throughout central and western Mexico, where we find burials where dogs have been sacrificed as retainers, their canine of choice. The Xolo, an ancient American Mexican hairless dog breed, just so happens to be a far more accurate representation of Anubis than a jackal could ever be. Additionally, Xolos were sacrificed after the death of their owners as guides to the underworld. So the Egyptians had Anubis, a dog-headed god whose principal responsibility was to usher souls into the underworld after death. And the ancient Americans had Jolot, a dog-headed god whose principal right was ushering souls into the underworld after death. But the experts want us to believe that these ceremonies, rituals, and idols have no connection. Two dog-headed gods who literally serve the same roles emerged on two opposite sides of the world merely by serendipitous happenstance. And if you believe that, hit me up on the CashApp or the PayPal, because I can flip $50 into 50 stacks by tomorrow. Throughout this documentation, we've highlighted pertinent aspects about the civilizations and cultures of the American Southwest and Central West Mexico, but there is plenty more we have yet to uncover. What we have yet to touch upon are the more sensational qualities of our arguments, such as the rumors of an Egyptian civilization in the Grand Canyon, or the piles of Egyptian artifacts found in and around that area. We have also yet to evaluate the American Southwest from the standpoint of geologic history and the catastrophic event that transformed the area from being one of the most abundantly well-watered places on Earth into a desert wasteland. However, most notably, we have yet to cover the biblical viewpoint in terms of relating ancient Egypt to the American Southwest and Mexico, and how Scripture could give insight into the hidden history of Egypt not acknowledged through mainstream academia. How does biblical prophecy play a role? We'll find out on the next episode of America is Egypt.